It claims to broadcast to 220 million households in more than 100 countries. And yet, few networks are as despised by governments and the right as Al Jazeera. If we believe its opponents, Al Jazeera is either a voice of the Muslim Brothers or in league with Israel and the United States. And if we believe its champions, it is challenging the West. What is the truth of this? The debate about Al Jazeera is based on a false premise, that it is an opponent of US dominance, that the US government is waging an information war against it, and that it is a source of insurgent news coverage. There is in fact relatively little to support this idea. Beginning in 1996, with a grant from the Qatari royal family, Al Jazeera was launched as a bid to strengthen its patrons' regional soft power and to win favour with its US allies. Its success as a 24-hour satellite broadcaster, resulting in its regional dominance by 2002, surprised everyone, its sponsors included. The Qatari monarchy, having liberalised its traditional censorship laws and abolished the information ministry in a bid to integrate into a globalised media market, allowed Al Jazeera a degree of freedom not usually experienced by Arab language broadcasters. Yet there are limits to this freedom. As Middle East author Juan Cole wrote for Salon, Al Jazeera will report frankly on every Arab government save that of Qatar, its host and benefactor. This, of course, was the point of Al Jazeera in its inception, to enhance the international prestige of its patron and flatter its Western supporters. Nonetheless, within these limits, Al Jazeera has allowed opposition voices to be heard in regimes that are unused to such opposition. It was Al Jazeera which hosted television debates between Iraqi oppositionists during Saddam's reign, and covered the Palestinian Intifada sympathetically, while still offending the then Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat. Other dictatorships in the Gulf region, above all Saudi Arabia, have applied relentless pressure to Qatar to get the network's coverage changed. According to an article in Foreign Policy by Mark Lynch, it was Al Jazeera's host, Faisal Al-Qasem, who opened an Arab-language talk show in 2003 as the US went to war in Iraq, with the cri de coeur, "Why do we always submit to the batons of rulers and their repression?" Al Jazeera first broke through during Operation Desert Fox, the US bombing campaign in Iraq in 1998. It was the only network to have reporters in the country at the time, and it subsequently defined itself by its commitment to journalism. Al Jazeera became an award-winning broadcaster and the most widely watched network in the states of the Persian Gulf and the Levant. But it was also the single broadcaster in the region to be denied recognition by the Arab States Broadcasting Union. Al Jazeera is accused on a network of neoconservative websites, from the Middle East Forum to the Gatestone Institute, of pandering to an anti-American Islamist agenda. In truth, they are repeating the claims made by warmongering governments. Back in the mid-2000s, it was reported by the British Daily Mirror, in a story that is now no longer on the paper's website, that a secret memo sent by George W. Bush to Tony Blair had discussed bombing Al Jazeera's headquarters, filled with 400 employees in Qatar. The story, leaked by the Labour Minister Peter Kilfoyle, was vehemently denied by Bush. Yet it wouldn't have been the first time that Al Jazeera was bombed. In 2001, its offices in Kabul were targeted by US bombs, as The Guardian reported, and in 2003, its Baghdad office was bombed again. Freelance journalist Dar Jamel wrote a piece for the Al Jazeera website describing how the Iraq War was the deadliest war for journalists, and he stated that the US attacked Al Jazeera's media outlet multiple times during the 2003 Iraqi invasion. The former British Home Secretary David Blunkett has revealed that during the war, he advised the Prime Minister to bomb Al Jazeera in Baghdad. Again, this was reported by the Daily Mirror. At the same time, it had also been reviled by the old Arab dictatorships. Gaddafi held several of Al Jazeera's journalists hostage during the US-led bombing campaign. It is also lamented by the Syrian regime and despised by the Egyptian dictatorship, which has accused its Cairo staff of being part of a plotting terror cell. This despite the fact that the journalists were all, according to the BBC in their piece "Who Are the Al Jazeera Journalists Tried in Egypt?", experienced international reporters. The truth is more complex than either its right-wing critics or its liberal champions suggest. While Al Jazeera did broadcast materials during the War on Terror that were inconvenient from the point of view of the US Pentagon, It reacted to international pressure by trying to win favour in the West. The first step was revealed by WikiLeaks in 2010. The Guardian reported that as early as 2004, the network began submitting its broadcasts to US censorship of its war coverage. The second step was the development of a new English language subsidiary in 2003, finally launched in 2006, effectively with a blank check from the Qatari regime. The idea was ostensibly to reverse the flow of information to the south and thus challenge media imperialism. Increasingly, however, its English language output deferred to the sensibilities of English speakers, and particularly of the Qatari regime's American backers. Perhaps nothing typified Al Jazeera more than its coverage of the Arab Spring, beginning with the Egyptian Revolution. Giving enthusiastic coverage to the opposition in Egypt, denied a platform by the regime, it identified with an emerging democratic public. Nor was it just Egypt. From Tunisia to Libya to Syria to Yemen, Al Jazeera was there before other broadcasters, and unlike other Anglophone networks, Al Jazeera had invested in the news bureaus and in the reporting. As Shad Hamid of the Brookings Institute told Reuters, they saw it was going to be big before other people did, and that it would stand as one of the historic moments in Arab history. The Egyptian dictatorship's decision to ban the network in the middle of the uprising, said Reuters, illustrated the leading role the Arab broadcaster has taken in reporting unprecedented popular revolts against Arab rulers. While The Economist saluted the Al Jazeera moment, British journalist Mehdi Hassan dubbed the channel the voice of the Arab Spring in The New Statesman, for taking the voices of the opposition and giving them a regional prominence they otherwise would not have achieved. Right-wing critics of Al Jazeera agreed. The Los Angeles Times blog reports that amid the Egyptian uprising, Fox News' Bill O'Reilly attacked the network for spurring on this revolt and encouraging uprisings all over the Muslim world. Ironically, however, it was precisely at this point that Al Jazeera's professionalism came into question most loudly among journalists. First of all, the regime sacked the news director, Wada Kanfar. The immediate justification for this was the revelation via WikiLeaks that Kanfar had toned down the station's Iraq coverage to appease the US in 2004 and 2005, as shown here by the New York Times. He had compliantly handed over copies of planned reports and acquiesced in US pressure to censor aspects of its coverage. But, as John Bradley wrote in the Jewish Chronicle, even with Kanfar's conciliatory approach to the United States, by 2011 the network's remaining independent streak was becoming an embarrassment to the Qatari regime in its attempted global integration with the American empire. With the change of leadership came a change of policy, and a number of journalists left, citing a clear political agenda on the part of the network. The German newspaper Spiegel Online quotes a former network journalist saying, "Al Jazeera takes a clear position in every country from which it reports, not based on journalistic priorities, but rather on the interests of the Foreign Ministry of Qatar." Ali Hashim, a former Al Jazeera journalist, tells Guardian readers that he was told by his bosses to ignore evidence of the militarization of the Syrian uprising in May 2011 and refused to broadcast footage of the fighters because it didn't fit the required narrative of a clean and peaceful uprising. In the case of Bahrain, where the Saudi regime, supported by the Gulf monarchies, including Qatar, went to war against a popular uprising, the television station had surprisingly little to say. Time magazine conducted a rather polite inquiry into the uneven nature of the station's coverage, and Al Jazeera spokesperson responded that the lack of coverage of Bahrain simply reflected the lack of significance of the uprising. If that were true, it's hard to believe that it would have needed Saudi tanks to put it down. And in Libya, the English channel was ultimately an important component of the strategy of the US-led coalition of states that waged war in the country in order to depose Gaddafi. As the Financial Times reported, the channel's decision to back the war followed the Qatari regime's involvement in the bombing campaign. As a result, the network shed all pretense at objectivity, referring to those killed by the regime as martyrs, while neutrally describing the bombing campaign as Western military operations. On top of the increasingly pro-US tilt of the network, it decided in 2013 to invest in a new channel for US audiences, Al Jazeera America. Yet Al Jazeera America suffered abysmal ratings as soon as it was launched. What went wrong? Part of the answer is that the network no longer has seemingly unlimited funds to sustain its operations. Funding for English language reporting was cut, and more emphasis was placed on revenue-generating product such as sports coverage. Al Jazeera America's spokesperson told Business Insider that it is intent on becoming profitable. This was predictable. One of the major lines of pressure from the US and Saudi Arabia was always to get the regime to privatize the network. In 2005, The Independent reported that the two countries were urging the government to speed up privatization plans, as this would most effectively muzzle the network by subjecting it to market pressures. Those pressures were resisted at the time. But now that Al Jazeera has arguably served its purpose as an asset of Qatari soft power, now that the purse strings are being tightened, its ultimate incorporation into the global media system would be a logical next step.